Hi, and welcome to our Old Testament class. I'm Kerry Muhlestein, and we're in our third lesson of the first half of the Old Testament. Today, we're talking about the stories of Isaac and Jacob. And I'm just excited to do this. There's some really foundational ideas and some foundational things in this narrative that we need to understand and that we can learn from. Some of the things from today that we talk about today will help us understand everything else in the Old Testament. So it's good stuff. And as I said, we're going to talk about a lot of narrative. You get that as we go through Genesis and Exodus. There's a lot of narrative that we learn from. It's basically storyline. It's not until you get to the prophets, you get to Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on, that we start to get a lot of doctrinal teachings. You'll get that in Psalms and places like that as well. But for the most part, we are dealing with narrative. So let's talk a little bit about why narrative and what we should learn from just the storyline. The storyline is the primary teacher in this first part of the Old Testament. So here are some of the things or reasons for learning from narrative and how we learn from them and what we should try and get out of it. We really do relate to stories better. As humans, we just relate to stories. We think of our life, it's kind of a story. When other people tell stories, we tune in, and you can even document in what's happening with the brain and brain waves that we tune into stories from people better than other things, or at least in a more concentrated way and in a different way. So we relate to those stories, we understand them, and we remember them. And so there are lessons that we will remember from stories that we don't learn or remember in other ways. It also takes theology or religious teachings, and it puts them on a real and applicable level, all right? So it's not just like, oh, yes, thank you for those nice teachings. It's good to know about those things. You see, this is how it works in a real life. And that's important because we have real lives. And so when we see other people's real lives, we can understand how these principles work for us, right? Now, relating to the first point, when we relate to a person, that intertwines with our ability to apply what happens to them in our lives. When I see that Jacob goes through some difficult family situations, or Joseph does, or Isaac does, I can relate to them because we all have families, and even the most wonderful of families, that's tricky, right? You have to figure out how to get along with each other and how to work together. And when we see that with them, we can relate to them, and then we can take those lessons and apply it to our lives better. That's one of the things I love about the Old Testament, is that this is probably more than any other book of Scripture where we see real people, kind of unedited, uncut, raw, real lives, and we see it's tricky. Abraham had a difficult life, and he had a lot of difficult family situations. So did Isaac, so did Jacob, so did Joseph. And we'll see it with Moses and with others as well. They have real things. They can't have children. Jacob gets injured. I mean, we have all sorts of things. There's jealousy between people. We try and figure out how to get along. That's the kind of stuff life is made of. And the Old Testament doesn't hide that. It puts it right out there for us with some of the most righteous women and men in the history of the world, and we have the opportunity to learn from them. And so as we relate to their stories and apply it to our lives, it can make a powerful difference in our lives. It also creates a better sense of how we fit into the big story of God dealing with his children. We see him dealing with these stories that are almost legendary, but we get these little tidbits of normalcy, or kind of, they're like us, and it helps us see that we fit into this big picture in an important way. And as we've kind of really said this, it helps us make sense of the crazy parts of our lives as we go see what they go through. It helps us see that people, even the best of people, sometimes struggle with how they use their agency, and they're impacted by the agency of others, and they have to deal with that. And that's something that happens for all of us. So one of the wonderful things it does for us is it helps reveal the nature of God. It helps us understand who God is and what he's like. Now, you'll remember from our last lesson that our relationship with God is a really key component in our mortal probation, in our covenant with God, and so on. And so understanding his nature and how he interacts with us is really, really important. And so as we see God and what he does and what he says, it helps us understand his nature better. And that naturally helps us understand better how he interacts with us. We see him interacting with others, being patient with them in their struggles, sometimes pushing them, sometimes putting them in difficult situations, and yet being there for them. And that interaction, both with individuals, and we're also going to see his interaction with Israel as a whole, and those interactions help us understand how he will interact with us and can give us faith and hope for the future. And so the narrative is key in that. One last thing is that it helps us focus on God's ability to save us. The Old Testament narrative will show us again and again and again God saving individuals or his people as a whole. And that helps us understand how he can save us. Right? So the narrative is a very powerful vehicle for understanding all of these things, especially our relationship with God and his desire and ability to save us. That's something that should come shining through all of these stories. So I'm so pleased to have the narrative in Genesis. It's some of the most powerful and compelling stories in the history of the world, and something that I relate to personally. The more I get to know them, the more real they become for me, the more I draw out of these stories. So with that, let's jump into the story of Rebekah and ask what we can learn from Rebekah's story. And of course, this is about Isaac and as well, and it's about Eleazar, the steward of Abraham and so on. But in many ways, Rebekah is the focus of the first part of this story. You have Abraham, who desperately wants for Isaac to marry, and not to marry a Canaanite or someone from where they're at, but someone from that family line. Remember, we read how he talked about he knew the right of the fathers to hold the covenant. We read about that in Abraham chapter 1 in our last lesson. So Abraham desperately wants Isaac to marry someone from that family line, someone that can have that covenant with him. But he does not want Isaac to go back to Haran or where he came from. Remember, Abraham's experiences there were not overly positive. They were trying to kill him. There's a lot of idolatry. He does not want to put Isaac in that situation. So instead, he sends his steward, Eleazar. This is the one who he thought maybe he would adopt and the covenant would be fulfilled through him. And he's been faithful and wonderful to him for a long time. He sends this servant back to Haran, to where he came from, to find a wife for Isaac from somewhere in that family line. Now, again, this seems weird to us, but this is the tradition. You typically marry somewhere within a family line. And so that's what he makes his servant promise to do, and his servant swore to him that he would do it. And Abraham said to him, if you find a person but she refuses to come, then you're released from this vow. Other than that, bring someone from there back home as a wife for Isaac. So he's respecting the agency of the women that will be there, but asking and hoping that one of them will come back to marry Isaac. And the servant goes up. He takes 10 camels with him, and he makes this long journey and comes to Haran, and he arrives at the well. And he's got his camels there, and he comes up with a plan. He makes kind of a deal with God, kind of figuring out a sign as to who would be the right person. So that brings up another point that's worth talking about, and we'll talk about it again when we get to Gideon and the story of the judges. But as Latter-day Saints, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we've heard both in the New Testament and Joseph Smith talking about people who seek for signs, and this is a wicked and an adulterous generation. And we tend to lump all signs together and think asking for signs is bad. But it's clear in the Scriptures, especially the Old Testament, but elsewhere as well, that there's a particular kind of sign that's a problem. That's when you say, I will not believe unless I see a sign. And that actually never will lead to belief, and that's where the problem lies. But for people who already believe and are actively pursuing God's will, God seems fairly willing to work with them in terms of signs. Doesn't always do it, but sometimes he does, where if someone says, I'm trying to do your will, I think this is what I'm supposed to do, can you let me know, is this the right thing? Am I doing it the right way? Are you still with me? How's this working out? Is it as you would like? He seems to be fairly willing to work with us in those kinds of signs. And so the servant asks for a sign, but I want you to stop and think about how clever this sign is. He wants for, if he finds the woman who is the right woman, someone who he thinks is the right wife for Isaac, that when he asks if she would give him water, that she will water his camels also. So let's explore exactly what that would entail. We don't know for sure what kind of camel this is, and for many areas, the use of camels was not really common yet, but we have figured out there are camels that are being used by this culture, and those kinds of camels can drink after a long journey between 20 and 50 gallons of water. All right, so if we take kind of the middle part of that, or say around 35 or something like that, 30 to 35 gallons that these camels are going to drink, and then we remember that he had 10 camels, that's over 300 gallons of water she's going to have to draw for these camels. That's not a small thing, right? This is quite the service she's offering to render when he says, can you give me something to drink? That's one time of putting the bucket or the skin in the well and drawing it up. And for camels, that's a lot of times, right? So think about the sign that he has created. If he finds a woman who is willing to do this, he has automatically found someone who we know is willing to work hard and is service-oriented and selfless. She sees someone, and out of the goodness of her heart, she volunteers to go beyond what is asked of her or what is even expected of her. She just wants to help. Well, that's a great kind of a characteristic to have in a spouse, isn't it? Someone who's hardworking and selfless and wants to help. I just think it's a fantastic sign. Fortunately, Rebecca is that kind of person. And so she offers, and then we find out that she's related to Abraham and is from this family that they're wanting to intermarry with. And the servant goes in and works with her brother, who seems to be the male steward for her, and that's how the traditions work, that you interact with the male in the family to arrange the marriage, and they arrange this marriage, but Rebecca seems to be fully on board and excited, even to the point where the next day when the servant says, hey, I'd like to hurry back, let's go, and Laban, the brother, says, well, let's ask her. She says, yeah, I'll go, right? So it's her choice. Whether she's going to go and whether she's going to go that soon. The family was like, well, we're probably never going to see her again. We'd like to hang around with her for a while. But she says, no, I'm ready to go do this. And that's a great sign. I cannot tell you, Rebecca is just incredible. We'll continue to explore Rebecca as we go along. But what an incredible person she is. And there's so much we can learn from her. And so she runs really with him, and off they go to go back to Isaac. And Isaac is happy, and they get married, and this is wonderful. And this leads us to the second part of the story, and we have to ask this question: what do we know about the birth of Jacob and Esau? Well, one thing is we know that it's granted of God. This is another story, and we get a lot of these in the Old Testament, where the woman is initially barren. She's not able to have a child. And we know that happened for a long time with Sarah. I think sometimes we don't think about the impact of that on that sacrifice of Isaac that we talked about, how long they had to wait and so on. But it's happening with Rebekah as well. And we don't know how long, but there's a while where they want to have children and they're unable to have children. And Isaac prays and prays, and then God grants that they can have children. So this is something they're very, very excited about. And then we have this interesting story that happens while Rebecca is pregnant, and we learn how much she turns to God and is willing to interact with God, and how much of a prophetess she is, or a seer. God will speak to her, and she knows what's going on. So this is the story in Genesis chapter 25, verse 22 and 23. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. It's so easy to pass over that line, but think about that. She's trying to figure out what's going on, and she goes to God, expecting that God will answer her, right? This is Joseph Smith-esque, as it were, or I guess Joseph Smith is maybe Rebecca-esque. She has a question, and she goes to God, and she gets an answer. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So these are some key things. She learns that they're twins. I don't know that they could tell that. They didn't have ultrasounds. I don't know that they could tell they were twins. She learns that she has twins and that they will become 2 great nations. So this promise that many nations will come from Abraham is being fulfilled already, that you've got Isaac and you've got Ishmael and you've got Midian and all sorts of other people that will all become nations. But now it's being fulfilled in another way, and that Isaac will have 2 nations, Isaac and Rebekah will have 2 nations come from them. And uh, these two sons will struggle with each other, or not just, well, the sons will struggle with each other, and then all of their descendants as nations will struggle with each other. And that's important to recognize. We're going to see that as we follow the history. The Edomites and the Israelites will have struggles even up into and at the time of Christ. That's happening. So we've got Edomites and Israelites that are going to have struggles with each other. And she learns, crucially, that the younger one will really be the birthright child. So we're going to have to talk about birthright in a moment here. But he's going to be the birthright child and will be the one that has rulership or leadership. That's very, very important to understand. So we've got this birthright child that's going to be the younger one, and it's revealed to Rebekah. I don't know if it's revealed to Isaac or not, or if she shares this with Isaac. I kind of suppose she did, and I kind of suppose that God would also inform Isaac himself if Isaac is willing to listen, and Isaac seems to be a very righteous man, so I'm going to assume he did, but the story doesn't tell us. What we do know is that Rebekah knows who is supposed to be the birthright child, and that's going to be an important element of the story as we go along. We also get in verse 25 and 26 of the same chapter, and the first came out red all over like an hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And that Edom means red, so the Edomites get their name partially because of being descended from Esau and partially because they live in an area with some red stone and so on. And after that, came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel. We'll come back to that in 1 second. And his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 old when she bare them. So Isaac is 60 years old when he has his children. We don't know exactly how old Rebekah is, but my guess is somewhere in that range, maybe a bit younger. In any case, this is a foreshadowing, as it were, of Jacob's personality and of experiences that he will have later, that he is holding on to his brother. That wrestling that we talked about, he's holding on to him and is tenacious and not going to let go. We'll see that story, that motif come up again when we get to the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel. So they have their children now. They're these two young men, and this is wonderful. And now they're trying to figure out where to live. So let's stop and talk a little bit about the lives that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah will have. All right, they are nomadic. Jacob and Rachel and Leah are not initially, and neither is Abraham initially, or Sarah, or Rebekah. Isaac seems to always have been, but when they lived in Haran, they were sedentary. They lived in a place, they were urban or semi-urban, they lived in a place, and they had their way of maintaining themselves there. But as they come into the land of Canaan, they're nomadic, and they're constantly going where the grazing is best and where the weather works well for them. And so there's this area called the Way of the Patriarchs that they kind of go back and forth in, up north and then down south and so on. And they don't have one place they stay all the time. There are some places they stay more than others, especially down south around Beersheba area. That's where they spend a lot of their time, but they are nomadic. So near Beersheba is a place called Gerar. And for a while, Isaac and Rebekah are going to go and stay in Gerar. Abraham stayed mostly in Beersheba. It seems like Isaac will stay mostly in Gerar. That may be because the relations with the people around them are changing. And that's another thing that we need to think about. They are a small group in the midst of people who have lived there for thousands of years. And they're the itinerant strangers that have inserted themselves into this place, and that's a tricky place to be. They're trying desperately to have good relations with these people, to work well with them. Their struggle over water and over resources and that kind of a thing, but they're trying to figure out how to get along with these people. You also have to remember that the Egyptians come through these areas and try to control the key trade areas, and there's some hand's length experiences they need to have with the Egyptians. Abraham had some bad and some good experiences with the Egyptians. The Egyptians take things from people, and they take people, right? They conquer and take them. And so my guess is that they tried to stay away from those areas where Egyptians had strongholds and where they would come regularly. If they heard they were coming, tried to avoid them. They had to be somewhat close to their neighbors, but also be somewhat distant from them, and so on. So this is a tricky thing that they're working with. And my guess is that as Isaac goes to Gerar, that there's something about what's going on with the different groups around them and how they're moving and what's going on that pushes him a little bit more towards Gerar, which is just a short distance from Beersheba. And it talks about how he's going to interact with Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Now, this is not the same group of Philistines that we're going to see them encountering in, say, Saul's and David's day. That's going to be a different group who seems to have come in and settled in some of the same areas that these Philistines were in, and so that's probably how they get their name. We're not exactly sure how they get this name. Or maybe that's the original name and they superimpose, whoever's writing this later as they're summarizing it or editing it later, superimposes that name on it. We don't know exactly how, but this Philistines are not the same Philistines as what we get later. There's a famine, and Isaac is thinking about going down to Egypt, and God tells him not to go to Egypt, as his father Abraham had when there was a famine, and as his son Jacob will when there is a famine. And are you starting to get the idea that famines are something, they're cyclical, but they come somewhat regularly? We get these, and this is true everywhere for all history of time. Weather happens in patterns, and you'll get prosperous years with lots of rain, and then you'll get years where there's not nearly as much. And this is also worth noting. I have some friends who've been doing some isotope and other kinds of studies of different archaeological remains, and it's actually clear that during Abraham's day, there was more moisture in that southern part of Judah than there is now. So it's not quite as hot and barren as it is now, but still, there were times where it was warmer and drier, and there were famines. And so Isaac is considering going to Egypt, but God tells him to stay there, so he goes and works with Gerar, and that's probably part of his movements and so on, or with the Philistines, Abimelech in Gerar. So he goes to this area, and I'm going to show you some pictures of the area the way it looks today, and we'll read some of this story. And there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. So about a generation later, there's another famine. Every generation seems to have one. And Isaac went unto Abimelech, king of the Philistines, unto Gerar. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, Go not down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee. Now, this is where we get some really key elements, this promise, I will be with thee. That's what he has already said to Abraham, and as we read this, you'll notice that all of this sounds very much like what he said to Abraham. And will bless thee, for unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abraham thy father. And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because that Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, and my statutes, and my laws. So do you see what's happening here is the covenant is being renewed with Isaac. Now that's interesting, and we need to explore this a little bit, and it's going to sound familiar to you. Isaac was part of the covenant naturally. He was promised to Abraham in the covenant. He's born into that covenant. He's actually named as and part of that covenant. So he's born into that covenant, and yet he will still have to individually make that covenant. There were some things that were happening for him because he was born of Abraham and Sarah, who were part of that covenant. But for the fullness of those blessings to come, he and Rebekah are going to have to individually enter into it. We don't have the account of Rebekah. Maybe I'm assuming too much of it. Maybe it just kind of happens automatically because Isaac is, I don't know, but I assume there's more than that. But in any case, the account we have is about Isaac. And Isaac individually makes this covenant with God, as we're reading here. And that's an important thing. And we're going to see the same thing happens with Jacob and with his sons and so on. You can both be born into the covenant and need to make that covenant yourself. And that's an important thing. So we see that all the covenant things that we talked about last time are being confirmed with Isaac here, and it will be reconfirmed sometime later. So you see this is happening in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 26. Now let's jump. We get a story of him interacting with the Philistine king and so on, and just like with Abraham and what happened in Egypt, Rebekah is so beautiful that the Philistines want to marry her, and they have this kind of deceitful I think that they have to engage in some kind of deceit, and we read in the book of Abraham that when Abraham does it, it's at God's behest, but they tell the truth. They're related to these people, right? Use the word sister. Both Abraham and Isaac call their wives sisters, and for Abraham, it's possible she actually is a half-sister, or she might be a cousin or something like that. There is no word in the languages they're speaking for a female relative that is not sister. There's not a cousin or something. They just call all of them sisters, all right? So it is true in a way that she is his sister. I think he's accurate when he says that. He just withholds the information about the wife part. That saves their life initially, and then sooner or later it's figured out, but the people they're interacting with let it go and respect the marriage that they have. So we get that story happening, and then we have, when we get to verses 24 and 25, the Lord appeared unto him, Isaac, the same night, and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and will multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. And he, meaning Isaac, builded an altar there, and called upon the name of the Lord, and pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants digged a well. So we see him entering into the covenant again. We actually saw that with Abraham. Abraham has the covenant given to him in some ways in chapter 12, but more ways in 15, and then we get 17, and then a couple times in the early 20s chapters. Abraham seems to have entered into the covenant and then entered either further or have it reestablished or reconfirmed again and again and again. We see that happening with Isaac. We're going to see it happening with Jacob. And I think we see it in our own lives as we enter into the covenant of baptism, more as we receive our endowments, more as we're married in the temple and so on. There are different ways and phases of entering into this covenant. And we see that here as we do in our own lives. So let's go back to this question. What should we learn from the storyline? Well, the story of Isaac receiving his promises, I think that we've just been talking about some of what we should learn, and that is how similar they are to us, and how similar this covenant is, and how important it is for each of us to individually make that covenant. We're going to follow this, and we'll see that it has to happen for Israel as a whole again and again as well. The individual nature, there's both a communal and an individual nature of the covenant. We have to be individually making and keeping these covenants ourselves. I think there's probably more going on with this, but we get such a limited amount of information about it happening that we don't have more to talk about because of that. We also have the story of Jacob receiving promises, and by this, I mean right now, the promise given to Rebekah while Jacob is in the womb, that he will be the birthright child. And I think there are a number of stories and lessons to learn from that. I hope you'll think of some on your own, but I'll highlight just the notion that God is involved. He knows what's going to happen before it happens, and he will work with those who have some kind of stewardship to make sure that they know what they need to know for these blessings to happen. Now we can move to the story of the mess of pottage. This is when Jacob and Esau are adults, probably young adults, but adults, and we have the story of how Esau is someone who loves to hunt. He's a hunter, and his father loves the venison, right? He's a chip off the old block maybe or something, and his dad loves the meat he brings in. And it says that Jacob is a plain man. That's the translation. I think probably a better, or that's the way the King James translators translated it. I think probably a better translation of that word is a well-rounded man. Whole or complete. There are all sorts of ways of looking at this, but I think well-rounded. He's someone, he's not just a hunter, he's not just a planter, he's kind of just your average guy who does a bit of everything, right? He's well-rounded and doing all the stuff he's supposed to. So Esau goes out hunting and comes home, and apparently he hasn't caught anything or shot anything with his arrow or whatever they're using, slings, whatever he's using to kill the animals, and he's starving to death. Now I have to assume here that Rebekah has told Jacob that he's supposed to be the birthright child. Jacob seems to be acting on that idea that he needs to do something. He knows he's supposed to be, but it doesn't seem to be happening, so he's supposed to do something to make it happen. That's a good lesson as well. When we know that there are blessings that are supposed to come, sometimes we don't know when they'll come, but we need to do what we can and also at the same time wait on God, right? We have to do our actions and also patiently wait on God. So that's where we find Jacob as this story is going on. He's doing what he can. And so he says to Esau, and let's read this. He says, we're in chapter 25, verse 31, and Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" Now, my guess is he can go another hour or two without dying, right? And whatever it takes to get some food. But he just wants this so much right now, and it's apparently not that important to him. And Jacob said, Swear to me this day, and he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So he didn't value it, is what it's saying. Now let's talk about the birthright and what it is and why it's important. There are a number of things that are incumbent upon whoever the birthright child is. That's typically going to be the oldest child, though we will see that in Genesis and Exodus, it hardly ever is that way. It's not that way with Isaac, who's not the firstborn. It's not that way with Jacob, who's not the firstborn. It's not that way with Joseph, who's not the firstborn. It's not that way with Moses, who's not the firstborn. And so God seems to be making a point of letting us know, yeah, you may think that this should just be an easy thing and always go to the oldest, but really it should go to the person who can best fulfill the responsibilities. So there is a number of serious responsibilities for the person who is the birthright child. That has to do, we won't go into all of them here, but it has to do with taking care of your parents as they age. There's no Social Security, there's no 401k. It's the responsibility of the birthright child to care for their elderly. It's the responsibility of the birthright child, and we'll see this in next lesson when we get to the story of Joseph and Judah, that when a child dies and leaves behind a spouse, to take care of that spouse and their children. If a member of the family gets sold into bondage or loses their land because they can't meet debts, it's the responsibility of the birthright child to buy them back and to take care of them. So the birthright child has a lot of things they're supposed to do, so they are given a double inheritance, twice as much as everyone else, so that they have the resources that they need to fulfill their responsibilities. Now, this brings us to a really important point that we have to understand very clearly, and it's difficult for us because we are so inundated by the ideas of the world. So the world teaches us that the leadership is about prestige and about power. That's what leadership is in the world's point of view. That is not God's definition. It's very clear it is not God's definition. In fact, you'll remember the story when James and John come to the Savior and they say, hey, can we be on your right and your left hand? And the other apostles are like, hey, what's going on? There's some kind of power play going on here. And the Savior says, you don't get it. The Gentiles, the princes of the Gentiles exercise authority over others, but with you it shall not be so. He that would be greatest among you shall be least. He that would be, and I'm paraphrasing, but then he says that if you're going to be the leader, you need to be the servant of all, right? In God's point of view, leadership is about service. It's never about power, prestige, importance, or value, or anything like that. That's not what it's about. President Nelson is a fantastic leader. I do not think he is more valuable than a primary child, a child in primary. That it's not about value or prestige or anything else. It's about service. President Nelson is called to serve the entire world. Leadership is about service. The birthright blessing is about serving the family and taking care of the family. All right, so there are some components of that. Some of that is a literal I guess it's not monetary is the right word, but material possessions element so that you can provide for the family in all the ways I've talked about. There also seems to be, well, there's no doubt there's a leadership component of this. And again, that's called a service, but that service does have an element, and this is important to understand, there is an element of leading out, saying we're going to go this way or go that way, not in trying to seek your own self-interest or in being the boss, but in the interest of serving others, right? But there's a leadership component. And it's this story that makes us think that maybe those two things could kind of be teased apart, because we're going to see that Jacob seems to, with this story, be obtaining the material possessions, and then we're going to encounter the story of receiving the blessing that seems to be about the leadership portion. All right, so in this story, he has bartered, as it were, with Esau to receive the material, the inheritance portion that the birthright child will receive. And as we just read, Esau is willing to trade this. He despises the birthright, is what we're told. Let's read what a couple of our leaders have taught us about this. So this from then Elder, now President Alan H. Oakes. The contrast between the spiritual and the temporal is also illustrated by the twins Esau and Jacob and their different attitudes toward their birthright. The firstborn, Esau, despised his birthright. Jacob, the second twin, desired it. Jacob valued the spiritual, and we're going to come back to this whole spiritual component in a moment. Jacob valued the spiritual while Esau sought the things of this world. When he was hungry, Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. Behold, he explained, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do me? Many Esau's have given up something of eternal value in order to satisfy a momentary hunger for the things of the world. There's a lesson to be learned from the narrative, right? That President Oaks teaches us eloquently. May we learn not to be Esau. So this is a question that I think you should ask yourself and think right now. Maybe if you need to pause this for a moment and come back to it, give some real thought to this. What is the mess of pottage in your life right now? We probably all have something. What is your mess of pottage? Something that the world is teaching you is valuable, that you are giving up your spiritual birthright in order to obtain this mess of pottage. And let's avoid it. Let's not be Esau. This is what President Monson taught us. Some foolish persons turn their backs on the wisdom of God and follow the allurement of fickle fashion, the attraction of false popularity, and the thrill of the moment. Their course of conduct resembles the disastrous experience of Esau, who exchanged his birthright for a mess of pottage. And what are the results of such action? I testify to you that turning away from God brings broken covenants, shattered dreams, and wrecked lives. We are of a noble birthright. Eternal life in the kingdom of our Father is our goal. Such a goal is not achieved in one glorious attempt, but rather is the result of a lifetime of righteousness, an accumulation of wise choices. In any case, I hope we get this idea that we want to be careful about the messes of pottage in our own lives and instead have this eternal perspective and pursue those spiritual and eternal rewards. Now, as we continue back to the story, we read this in chapter 26. Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Bashemoth, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, which were a grief of mine unto Isaac and to Rebekah. So he is marrying people who are not of that lineage that Abraham talked about that have the right for the covenant. And we're going to talk about lineage in just a moment and that kind of a thing. So let's keep that in mind. But they are not of this, and the idea is that they will then lead Esau away from keeping the covenant. That's the problem that is always posed when you marry someone who's not in a covenant consciousness and not part of all of this. And so this is a grief to them. Esau, when he sees it's a grief to them, tries to make up for it by marrying some people from Ishmael and so on and so on. But as part of it, then Rebekah says, I really want Jacob to marry someone from this family line that we've talked about. So let's now talk about the story of Jacob being blessed by Isaac. And there are a number of things that we can learn from that. It's a complex story. It's one that we sometimes struggle with because there's some deceit involved. There's no doubt. This is the story where Rebekah hears that Isaac is going to give Esau the birthright blessing. So we're going to assume this is that leadership portion of the birthright blessing. It's an actual blessing rather than inheritance, it would seem. And so she hears that it's going to happen and that Esau is going to go out hunting. And so Rebekah, we're going to come back to motives in a minute. Right now, we're just going to do the story. Rebekah comes to Jacob and says, we need to get you being the one that's being blessed, so we're going to have to trick Dad, basically. And Isaac says, but I'm hairy. But Esau's hairy and I'm not. So she puts goat hair on him, and she makes some soup that Isaac will like, and she sends him in, and Isaac, who's not able to see so well, he's getting old enough. This is before cataract surgery, apparently, so he's not able to see so well, and he kind of smells and feels Jacob and tastes the soup and says, okay, this is this is Esau, and he gives him the blessing, and then Esau comes back and learns that Jacob has received that blessing, and he's torn and upset, and Isaac says, I'll give you a blessing, but that Jacob has that blessing. All right, so let's explore this a little bit. It's hard to know exactly what's going on. The story does not tell us the motives, the intents, or very much of the thoughts of the actors involved. But we know enough that I think we can piece together some things. So let's think about the things we do know. What we know is that Jacob is supposed to receive the birthright. And we know that at least Rebekah, and it seems like Jacob know that. My guess is probably Isaac as well. They know that that's supposed to happen, and they can see that it is not what is happening. And so I think that this is another time when Rebekah says, I need to take matters into my own hands. things are not happening the way it seems like they're supposed to. We know these blessings are promised. What can we do to make them happen? And so she comes up with this story to fulfill the greater truth, which is that Jacob is supposed to receive this blessing. Now, again, my guess is that Isaac knows this is supposed to happen, but he's had a hard time getting himself to do it because Esau's his guy. He's a chip off the old block and so on. And again, we're seeing a glimpse into the complexities of family lives, right? Sometimes there's sibling rivalry. Sometimes parents don't agree on what and how they should do with their children, and so on and so on, right? This gets complex. It's all going to work out. Let's remember that. That's the important thing, but not without some difficulties. And we go through those difficulties as well. In any case, my guess is that Rebekah knows Isaac needs to be nudged, right? And this is not uncommon where one spouse, tempted to say typically the wife, but maybe that's just me reflecting on my own marriage. But anyway, one spouse is nudging the other to do what they know they need to do. And that certainly happens in many settings and situations. And this nudge involves tricking Isaac. I don't recommend this as practice in your own family, but that's what happens here. So Rebekah does this, and Isaac gives the blessing. And then Isaac learns that it's the wrong blessing. It's not the wrong blessing. He learns that it's not the son he was thinking of. It's actually the right son, but not the son he was intending to do. Now, what we know about priesthood power is that things can be bound. They can also be broken. I believe Isaac could undo this blessing if he wanted to. In fact, let's read this from again, Elder Oaks at the time, now President Oaks. He says, however, like most who officiate in healing blessings, I have often struggled with uncertainty on the words I should say. For a variety of causes, every elder experiences increases and decreases in his level of sensitivity to the promptings of the Spirit. Every elder who gives a blessing is subject to influence by what he desires for the person afflicted. Each of these and other mortal imperfections can influence the words we speak. Fortunately, the words spoken in a healing blessing are not essential to its healing effect. If faith is sufficient and if the Lord wills it, the afflicted person will be healed or blessed whether the officiator speaks those words or not. Conversely, if the officiator yields to personal desire or inexperience, or we could add in here, or is tricked by his sons, and gives commands or words of blessings in excess of what the Lord chooses to bestow according to the faith of the individual, those words will not be fulfilled. All right. And what's more, as we said, it would seem that Isaac can undo this blessing. But when he realizes that Jacob has received it, I suppose, this is speculation on my part, but I suppose that he recognizes, this is what was supposed to happen anyway. I will let this stand, and I will give Esau the blessing that Esau should be getting. And I think that's what happens. So Jacob ends up with the blessing that he was supposed to get. Esau ends up with the blessing that he's supposed to get through an unpleasant, odd, and tricky, complex situation. But this is what happens, all right? And Jacob has the blessings he's supposed to get. But now we know that Esau is so upset with Jacob that he wants to kill him. And this brings us to another element of the story and the narrative. We need to learn from the story of Jacob and his family. So what happens is Jacob knows and Rebekah knows that Esau wants to kill him. And so Rebekah says, you just need to get out of town for a while. Esau will calm down, but you need to get out of town for a while. This won't actually end up being what happens. When Jacob leaves, he doesn't come back until his parents are dead. This will be the last he sees his parents, right? These are sacrifices. These are tough things. But that's what her intent is. You'll need to leave town for a little while as you let your brother calm down. And then they talk about, she talks to Isaac and says, I really don't want Jacob to marry anyone from here, which is true. I think she's getting kind of a two-for-one here. She's getting Jacob out of town, and she's sending him to where he can marry from the family that they would like him to marry. So Isaac and Rebekah send Jacob off to where Rebekah's from and where Abraham was from, back to Rebekah's family to find a wife. And as I said, that will be the last that Jacob sees of his parents, sadly. And so let's talk about that family just a little bit. There's no quiz on this, but this can hopefully help you understand the family line a little bit. We've got Terah, who has these different sons, including Abram or Abraham and possibly Sarai. It's a little fuzzy on that. They have Isaac as a child, but we have from Nahor, We have from Nahor, we'll end up with Bethuel, who ends up with Laban and Rebekah, right? And then Rebekah has the son Jacob, while Laban has daughters Leah and Rachel. So Jacob will marry Leah and Rachel, his cousins. All right, so that's so that we can understand this story. So let's go through this storyline just a little bit, tell the story, and then we'll talk about lessons as we go, but also we'll try and draw some bigger lessons as we get to key points in this story. So we know that as Jacob leaves, he goes a bit of a journey, and he stops overnight at a place that is called Luz at the time, L-U-Z, Luz or Luz, and he will stay overnight there. And he'll rename it Bethel because of what happens there. So let's talk about Bethel. All right, I've got a picture here looking out towards these hills that are just covered in the haze there, but that's where Bethel is. Literally, it means house of God. Beit is house, and El is God, house of God. There's a tradition and an apocryphal work that says that it's on Mount Moriah, which tradition holds is where the Temple Mount is, or the Dome of the Rock is now. There's that tradition, but most tradition holds that it's at what is now called Bethel, the area I'm showing you there, just north of Jerusalem. So that's the more likely site, in my opinion, and where most people hold that site to be, just north of Jerusalem, at the beginning of what would become the territory of Ephraim, when the land is divided among the tribes. All right. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens there? What is significant? You remember the story that Jacob goes to sleep and he has a dream, and in this dream he sees what we assume is Christ and angels, and there's a ladder or steps with people going up and down, all right? And he has an experience there where he's given promised blessings. In fact, let's read that. So we're in chapter 28, verse 12. And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it, and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and thou shalt spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land, for I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. All right. That's so much the same words that we saw spoken to Abraham and to Isaac. It's clear that this covenant is being established with Jacob, who was born into that covenant, but it's being established with him there. And so we see that the blessings of the covenant being pronounced upon him. And then he wakes up and he makes an altar there, as we saw Abraham do, and as we saw Isaac do. He makes an altar to offer sacrifice to the Lord because of the covenant that was entered into there. So let's think about some of the significant things that happen as a result of that experience. First of all, Jacob, who's been taught about God from his mother and his father, learns and has an experience with God for himself. We all need that, right? We may not have this kind of a dream, but we all need to learn from others and then have experiences with God ourselves. After he learns about God for himself, in some ways we could say this is when he becomes a prophet, right? And prophet is, that word's used differently in different times, but this is someone who learns from God and does God's will and can speak things that God wants him to speak. And so in some ways this is when that really starts for Jacob. He's also promised that his seed would be blessed and that God would be with them. So we've got that Abrahamic covenant element. And he learns of the sanctity of God in space. He recognizes that since God has been here, he sees the difference between himself and God, how holy God is, how different from himself God is. And then he recognizes that because God has been there, it's changed that place. And now this is a holy place. It's a kind of a temple, I would argue. So some have suggested that he receives his version of the endowment here, those temple covenants, especially President Marion G. Romney, who suggested that the rungs or the steps on the ladder were the covenants that were there, right? Now, I don't want to suggest that he had the exact same experience we have in our temples. the ordinances and the covenants and blessings are essentially the same. The way they're administered changes over time. So, but he had some kind of thing here that gave him these covenants and these blessings, right? And he certainly receives power and blessings there. Let's read what President Marion G. Romney had to say about this experience. He said, Jacob realized that the covenants he made with the Lord there were the rungs on the ladder that he himself would have to climb in order to obtain the promised blessings, blessings that would entitle him to enter heaven and associate with the Lord. Because he had met the Lord and entered into covenants with him there, Jacob considered the site so sacred that he named the place Bethel, a contraction of Beth Elohim, which means literally the house of the Lord. Temples are to us all what Bethel was to Jacob. And I think that's exactly right. It's a place where we enter further into our relationship with God via covenant, right? That's so important. And so he has that experience there that as he's leaving the promised land, confirms to him that that is still his promised land and that he and his descendants will have that covenant continue with them. We're going to explore in just a moment that and it's not said anywhere explicitly here, but we will see that this is the case, that there's some kind of a change here. Because you remember with Abraham, while he had several sons, and they all received serious blessings and promises from God, that fullness of that covenant only went through one, and that's Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had two sons, and they'll both receive blessings from God, but the fullness of the covenant will only go with one, and that's Jacob. But that changes with Jacob. All of his children can receive the fullness of that covenant. They'll each get their own individual kinds of blessings in there, but they all receive the fullness of that covenant. And from then on, that covenant seems to be more and more and more available. So we'll explore that as we go along. In any case, after having this marvelous experience where he may feel like he is losing his covenant connection as he leaves the promised land and he leaves his parents who have taught him of the covenant and up until he made the covenant himself, through whom he enjoyed covenant blessings, he now has the assurance that that covenant is with him and it will continue with him, including that promised land. He goes up to Haran, to the same well where the servant had met Rebekah, and there he will meet Rachel. Right, so we get to this, and now I have this picture of three of my children drawing water from a well or a spring, just so you can kind of get an idea of what that might look like. But I love this story because he gets there and the well is covered, and they say, well, it's not time for it to be uncovered yet, but when it is, then all of us will have to go over and uncover it because it's such a big stone over the well. And then Rachel comes. And Jacob is so smitten with Rachel. She seems to have this, family beauty trait going on, but there's also just something about her that he gets up and on his own, he moves and uncovers the well, right? It just doesn't need other people. This guy can do it on his own. Probably a strong guy, but also inspired by the love he sees and feels for Rachel. And we all know the story. It's a tricky story. This is where we get some real complicated family relationships because Jacob is madly in love with Rachel. And he talks to her father, his uncle, Laban, and says that he would like to marry her. But he doesn't have anything to give the family. Remember that Abraham's servant brought all sorts of jewelry, gold, and so on. But Jacob has nothing. So the deal they work out is that he will work for Laban for 7 years. To be able to marry Rachel. And the culmination of that is described with one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture. It's just such a beautiful and in some ways romantic verse. We're in chapter 29, Genesis 29, verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. Right? The 7 years were like nothing to him because he was working towards Rachel because he loved her so much. A 7-year engagement, that's a long engagement. And then, of course, we know it doesn't work out so well because he's tricked. Apparently, the wedding is performed while wearing a veil, and as they go to the tent and it's dark and she's wearing a veil, and they consummate the marriage, and then he learns that this was really Leah. That Laban has tricked him, saying, well, the oldest needs to marry first, and so he's married Leah. Now, I can't imagine how this makes anybody feel. Put yourself in Leah's shoes. How would you like to be the person that is not who your husband wanted to marry and who he's tricked into marrying? that's not going to make you feel very good about yourself or about your relationship with him. How would you like to be Rachel? The man you love just married your sister. And how would you like to be Jacob? You worked 7 years for someone you were madly in love with, and now you found out you married someone else. You might naturally have a little bit of resentment towards her, even if you were trying not to. You will certainly, I think, have some resentment towards Laban, and you're going to be heartbroken about Rachel. And you maybe feel some crazy feelings about yourself as well, that you were tricked into this and so on. I mean, this is complicated stuff. Of course, he goes to Laban, and Laban says, well, sorry, this is what happened. And he allows him to marry. He has to wait a week, and then he can marry Rachel with the agreement that he will work another 7 years. Right? So he is tricked in, and this is part of why he doesn't get back home to see his parents. He agreed to 7 years so that he could marry Rachel, maybe thinking he'd go back then. Now it's 14 years. Right? And we know he's also worried about Esau, so that's part of why he's not going back. But he's had to work 14 years instead of 7 to marry Rachel. We'll come back to how difficult that is, but that's tricky stuff, right? And then we get the whole story of children. He loves Rachel, and again, I don't know how I would, if you were madly in love with one person and were tricked into marrying another person, even if you're kind to the other person, it's going to be clear who you fell in love with and who you didn't. And you won't be able to help but interact with people differently. One that is your nice, what you thought would be sister-in-law, and the other who you were madly in love with, right? And of course, there's jealousy between the sisters. Even if everyone is trying their best to do well, these are complex emotions, difficult things that they're working through. And as part of it, you're going to have Leah able to have children. And for couples today, children are so important. I mean, I know when people, I know very close family members who have struggled having children, and it's heartbreaking. It's difficult. But it was even more important for these cultures. Really important, especially for the potential mothers. And so Leah having children and Rachel not having children is a huge deal. And Leah probably feels like, well, this makes up for me not being the loved wife. And Rachel probably is thinking, Jacob did love me, but will he stop loving me because I don't bring him children? And so you get this complex set of things where Leah's having children and Rachel can't, so then she has Jacob marry her handmaid, and that child, she has children, so then Leah has him marry her handmaid, and she's having children, and everyone's having children but Rachel, and you get, just little glimpses like when there's the whole mandrakes story where Reuben finds some mandrakes, and there's this belief that they help with fertility, and Rachel wants so badly to have children, she's bartering time, intimate time with Jacob to be able to have the mandrakes so that maybe she can have children, right? I mean, just think of the complex emotions that are going on here, the difficult trials they're all going through. This is tough. It really is tough. And they're working their way through it the best they can. And I'm sure not always perfectly, and yet fairly well for really difficult circumstances. Finally, Rachel is able to have a child as well, and so on. In the meantime, after the 14 years of working to pay off his debt to Laban, now Jacob can start working for Laban for wages, all right? So we'll come back to that in a moment. But we now have 11 sons accounted for. We'll get Benjamin born after they move back down into the land of Canaan. But we have 11 sons accounted for. We know we'll have 12. So this brings up an important topic, and that's the idea of the house of Israel. We just need to explore that a little bit, and these questions are what we're going to look at. What should we understand about the house of Israel? Is it important? Why is it exclusive? And why a certain family? Those are questions that I often get as we talk about the house of Israel. So the Abrahamic covenant will go through Jacob's children, in particular these 12 sons, the house of Israel that becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. And from then on out, the scriptural story and the story of the covenant revolves around this family and these 12 sons or these 12 tribes. Is it important? I think we can say absolutely. No doubt it's important. This is covenant and gathering and promises are all hinging on this. All right, and we talked before about the covenant and how important it is, so that explains part of why it's so important. But we'll get into that a little bit more as we talk about why a certain family, but let's address this idea of whether or not it's exclusive. And I find a lot of people are concerned about that. We live in a day and age where, rightly so, we are very sensitive about certain things being available to someone because of who they're descended from, rather than to someone else. And is that fair, we ask? So let's address that question. Is it exclusive? And I would argue that it's not exclusive. In fact, I would argue this is the most inclusive thing in the history of the world, period, bar none. We want everyone to be part of this covenant. In fact, it's an obligation under the covenant, as we talked about, to share the covenant with everyone else, to try to get everybody else to be part of this covenant. We want everyone. Think of what we do today. Let's just think of it in today's terms. Think of all of the effort and the resources and the time and the heartache and the energy and the soul that we put into trying to share the gospel with everyone. In terms of full-time missionaries and all the resources spent there, service missionaries, senior missionaries, right? So we've got young missionaries, we've got senior missionaries, both full-time, and then everything that we all do, every member a missionary kind of stuff, with ward mission committees in each ward and everything else. We are doing everything. We're putting our whole heart and soul into getting everybody to be part of this covenant. And then we spend equally as much effort and resources into getting people who died before they had the chance to make the covenant, to be part of the covenant on the other side of the veil, in terms of temples and family history work and so on and so on. Think of all that we're doing to give people the opportunity on either side of the veil. We want everybody, dead or alive, we want everybody to be part of this covenant. That's as inclusive as you can get. In fact, the only way to not be part of the covenant is to refuse to be part of the covenant. Everyone, every single person that has ever been born will not only have the opportunity, but will be begged and pled with to be part of this covenant. And if they are not, it is because they refused. It really, literally is the most inclusive thing that has ever been on the face of the earth. Everybody is invited to be part of this covenant. So it's not exclusive, but we have to ask ourselves still, why is it going through this particular family? Well, let's ask the question in general, why a family? And to answer that, let's kind of explore this. God needs someone who will share the covenant, right? He needs someone who will receive, know, understand the covenant, and then go share it with others and administer that sharing. That's what God needs, is to get someone who will try and get everyone else. And so he's going to have some kind of a group that he works with. Well, what kind of a group does God work with? Families, right? That's the most important group. We are God's family. He works with families. And so he chose a family, starting with Abraham. Well, starting with Adam, but it keeps having to be reestablished as mankind rejects the covenant. We've already covered that in lesson 1 and 2. But he chooses Abraham, he chooses Isaac, he chooses Jacob, he chooses Jacob's sons. He chooses this family because of their willingness to do what he asks. And that's what he needs, is someone who will go out and do what he asks. And so these especially, we've got Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. These are people who are willing to do what God asks. And so they're a family that he says, please go get everyone else to be part of this family, right? That's important stuff. And we need to recognize that God is doing this out of love to bring everyone into relationship with himself and to recognize its importance. Making the covenant and becoming part of the house of Israel is essential. And then getting other people to become part of the house of Israel is essential. And all of scriptures from this time forward are about the house of Israel and the scattering and the gathering of the house of Israel. And one of the fortunate things, the scattering, and we'll cover this when we get to the second half of the Old Testament, but one of the reasons for the scattering is to humble Israel as they're not keeping the covenant or trying to share it anymore. It's to humble them, but it serves a second purpose. As they scatter throughout the entire earth, then as God gathers them, they can bring the entire earth with them. Right? So the being part of the house of Israel is really important. We could read tons of scriptures about this. I'm just going to mention one and we'll read another. Well, let's read both of them. Let's go to the title page of the Book of Mormon. This is where we will learn part of how important it is. This is the most correct book on the face of the earth. And And as we read this title page that talks about the purpose of this most correct book, we read, just as we get in just a little ways, that it's written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to Jew and Gentile. So it's about house of Israel, and the Gentiles. Written by way of commandment, and also the spirit of prophecy and revelation, written and sealed up and hid up unto the Lord, that they might not be destroyed, to come forth by the gift and power of God. We're going to skip down just a little bit to the first dash in the second paragraph. Which, meaning this record is to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel, so it's specifically to the house of Israel, and to show them, number one, what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers, so what God has done inside the covenant. Two, and that they may know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever. That the covenants are important, they have to know what they are, and that we can be part of the covenant even when we've strayed. And three, also to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself unto all nations. And that's incredibly important because Jesus is sent to fulfill the covenant, right? It's clear that the covenant is incredibly important. One of the reasons that we need to recognize the importance of the covenant is conveyed in 1 Nephi chapter 19, verse 23. And this is a verse that you're probably familiar with, but we often don't really fully realize what is going on here. So let's go to 1 Nephi chapter 19, verse 23, where, as we know, Nephi says, "And I did read many things unto them," his brothers Laman and Lemuel, "which were written in the books of Moses, but that I might more fully persuade them to believe in the Lord their Redeemer, I did read unto them that which was written by the prophet Isaiah, for I did liken all scriptures unto us, that it might be for our profit and learning." And most of us, when we hear that, we've been taught that likening the scriptures unto us mean doing kind of what we have been doing. Okay, I see this story about Jacob, or about Isaac, or about Rebekah, or about Sarai, or Mary, and I put myself in their shoes, and then I can liken it to myself. That's certainly an important and valid interpretation, and that's an important thing to do. It's not what Nephi was specifically talking about here. It's a kind of an extrapolation of that, and an important one that we should do. But let's look at what he was specifically talking about. If you were to read all the verses before this, you would see that he's talking about the promises to the house of Israel. Let's read verse 24, the verse after it. Wherefore, so note the connecting word. He's likening unto them, and because he wants to liken to them for their profit and learning, wherefore I spake unto them, saying, Hear ye the words of the prophet, ye who are a remnant of the house of Israel, a branch who have been broken off. Hear ye the words of the prophet, which were written unto all the house of Israel, and liken them unto yourselves, that you may have hope as well as your brethren from whom ye have been broken off. All right. You see what he is really saying. He is saying that the scriptures, he's saying in particular Isaiah, but really all the scriptures are written about the house of Israel. And you, Laman and Lemuel, or you, whoever is listening to this lesson, are of the house of Israel. Therefore, these scriptures are about you. You should find yourself in them as you read. They are about the fulfillment of the promises to the house of Israel, or the Abrahamic covenant. Since you're part of that, you should see yourself in them and how specifically it applies to you. One of the things I would really encourage you to do, and I do this with all of my students, is as you read this Old Testament, as we study this together, think of it as your family history. You probably have some family history that you read about great-grandma Esther or great-grandma Mildred or someone along those lines, and that is family history, and that's important. But let's not forget that great-great-great-great-great-grandma Rebecca and great-great-great-great-great-grandma Sarah are also our family history. As you are reading this Old Testament, you are reading your family history, and the promises made there are about you. And you find yourself in those promises, and it will make a difference and change the way you read the scriptures. President Nelson has really stressed this lately. We could read 1,000 things from him about this, but we will just read this one. We of modern Israel are among the covenant people of the Lord, and most remarkably, the Abrahamic covenant will be fulfilled only in these latter days. The Lord bestowed this Abrahamic covenant upon the prophet Joseph for the blessing of him and the posterity after him. Did you know that Abraham is mentioned in more verses of modern Revelation than in all the verses of the Old Testament? Abraham, this great patriarch of the Old Testament, is inextricably linked to all who joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ancient Israel and modern Israel are linked arm in arm. Right. That's something that we need to understand, and as we do, the scriptures will become more powerful for us, and the stories that we're going through will speak to us in a different way. So, understanding that, and Jacob's had his children, let's go back to Jacob's story. Jacob is now going to leave and go back home to Canaan. Why is he doing so? Because God told him to. Yes, there are some growing tensions between him and Laban, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but the real reason he's going is because God told him to. So let's ask this question. What happens to Jacob between Bethel and Peniel? Peniel is where he will stop and have this wrestle and experience with God on his way back down. So he has an experience with God on his way up to Syria, and he has another one on his way back down, both of them in the Promised Land or in Canaan. So what happens to him in between? Well, we've talked about it a little bit already, but let me summarize it in this way. He works 7 years and is tricked. So he works another 7 years. Then he works another 7 years where God is continually blessing him, but his employer, his uncle, is continually changing his wages, trying to make it so he's not so blessed. In the meantime, he's having all of this difficult conflict maybe is too strong a word, but conflict is these different family tensions, right? Almost everything that is happening for Jacob none of it is happening easy. It's all happening in a very difficult way. But he's doing what he was asked to do again and again and again. He's being blessed by God, but it's never simple and it's never easy. The blessings are coming, but through great pain and toil and turmoil. But he proves himself that he is willing to do whatever he needs to despite how hard it is. And then God tells him to go back to the land of Canaan. Now, why did he leave? Because his brother was going to kill him. And he still has fear that his brother will kill him. Right? This is his real fear. So what happens when he is at Peniel? All right, it's the ford of the Jabbok River. I don't know if this is exactly the place, but this is the Jabbok River. It's in modern-day Jordan. He has to go across it at some point as he's coming down from Syria into Jordan and then across into Canaan. And most of the area, you can see the steep hills around there. Most of the area, it's not very passable. This is one of the more passable areas, so it's a good candidate for where he might pass. If it's not here, it's somewhere like this. In any case, he's going to stop. Now, I want you to look at the text. Just pause for a moment and look at the text and look at everything that Jacob does to try to protect his family. So stop this and look at that. All right, did you notice the things he's doing? He is so worried that his brother is going to kill him and his family that he sends gifts, huge amounts of gifts. This shows you how wealthy he's become with the way God was blessing him, but huge gifts in terms of sheep and goats and cattle and so on. And he sends them out one after the other, after the other, after the other. So what he's hoping is that as Esau is coming, he will see one gift and it will make him feel a little bit better about his brother. And he's also trying to show Esau that he's not coming back to claim his inheritance. Esau can have his inheritance, right? He's doing well enough. But he's hoping that his heart will be softened as he encounters one gift and then another, another, and another. Now, just to make matters worse, he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men. There's no reason to come with 400 men if you're just coming to say, welcome back, brother, right? Now, it turns out that is what he's doing, but there's no reason for it. He is coming with 400 men, and Jacob has to assume, this is to kill us all. He's going to massacre us. So he sent all these gifts. Now what does he do? I cannot imagine doing this as a parent. He takes his family and divides them into two. This is why the area also ends up being called Mahanaim, because that means two camps. He divides them into two, sending one this way and the other this way, hoping that if half are massacred, maybe the other half would escape. Can you imagine doing that? Can you imagine if you had 6 children saying 3 this way, 3 this way, saying, I hope I see at least half of you again? I can't imagine what he's going through. So he's done all of this, and then he's still worried. He's still worried that his brother is going to massacre his family. So after having done everything he can think of doing, he engages in mighty prayer. Now, my guess is he's been praying all along. Before doing any of these things, he's been praying as he goes. He's been saying, God, I'm going because you told me to, but I'm worried about this. Please protect us. Please help us. And then he does all of these other things, and now he's back to praying. And in his prayers, he's basically got to be saying, God, I'm worried that what I love the most, my family, is going to be taken from me. I'm doing this because you asked me to, and despite how afraid I am that's going to happen, I am still doing it. Please protect them. Now I want you to stop and think about when we talked in the last lesson about an Abrahamic sacrifice. This is an Abrahamic sacrifice. He is willing to sacrifice his entire family if that's what God wants. And it's clear because he's got them out there even though he's afraid that they will die. And so he's making the sacrifice and pleading with God that it won't be necessary. Fortunately, it won't be necessary. But that's what's happening as he then has this experience with an angel. So let's ask this question. What is this wrestling business when he wrestles with an angel? And we'll read the account in just a moment and try and get a little bit more into it. But what is this business? Well, we know it's used figuratively many times in the scriptures. The idea of wrestling, I mean, it can be a real wrestle, but it can also be this idea that you have an internal striving with yourself and a striving with God. I cannot imagine that the prayers he's engaged in are not that, right? Now, this is also a literal wrestle. The Bible goes to great efforts to show that it's literal because his thigh is disjointed, right? His hip, it goes out of socket or something along those lines, and he's wounded and limps because of it. So it also is a literal wrestle, and this is typical, and this is something we need to understand, and we'll talk about this many times, but it's typical of this culture. This culture, there is an outward symbol or action for inward things. There's always that way. We could say that we don't know what language they're speaking, Aramaic or who knows what. It's not quite Hebrew. We often talk about Proto-Hebrew or something before Hebrew. We don't know exactly what it is, but whatever language they're speaking is not actually their primary language. Their primary language is what we would call symbolic action. The things you do speak the loudest. And so we're going to see symbolic action being an important part of so many stories in the Old Testament, including this one, where often there's a literal thing you go through that speaks to the inner thing that you're going through. And so he's having a literal physical wrestle, like he did with Esau when they were born, but he's having a literal physical wrestle that matches the inner striving he has as he is pleading and begging with God, please protect my family. Right? Now we have to ask, who in the world is he wrestling? In some ways, that we're going to see that this is Jehovah, but the physical wrestle, or the Lord, right? But it can't be him. He doesn't have a physical body yet. I'm going to have to assume this is a translated being, someone from the All-Star Enoch, City of Enoch wrestling team or something like that. I don't know, but because there's no resurrected being, so if it's someone with a physical body, it's someone that has come down and gone back up with a physical body still. As we mentioned, this is reminiscent of his birth. And I also want to bring up what Brigham Young said about this. He said, "We are all on the same ground, and we must struggle, wrestle, and strive until the Lord bursts the veil and suffers us to behold his glory, or a portion of it." Right? I think that's exactly what happens with Jacob. So let's read through this, and then we're going to try and tease out a couple of key elements of this. So after he sends all these messengers and everything else, we get in chapter 32, verse 24. "And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him," it's confusing who the he's are, but this seems like when the angel or the man saw that he prevailed not against Jacob, the angel or man, he touched the hollow of his thigh. The angel or man touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he," apparently the angel, "said, 'Let me go, for the day breaketh.' And he," meaning Jacob, "said, 'I will not let thee go except thou bless me.'" Do you see this, how reminiscent this is of his birth? He's going to hold on to this guy's leg or whatever else, even when his leg is out of joint, no matter what happens, he's holding on. However long it takes, however hard it is, he is holding on until he receives the blessing that he wants. Oh, what a marvelous example. There are blessings that I want so badly for members of my family right now. And this is all I can do, is just pray and pray and pray and wrestle with God and hold on until those blessings come. What a marvelous example. "And he," meaning the angel, "said unto him, 'What is thy name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' And he," meaning the angel, and we're going to see that this maybe at some point it switches and it's not just an angel he's talking with, but anyway. "And he said, 'Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed.' And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. All right, so that's an interesting little gap in the story. So let's address that. Some of the things that happens, he's blessed with power there. His name is changed, and this typically signifies a change in your nature. Right? So we know what happened with Avram and Sarai, who become Abraham and Sarah. As they receive the covenant, their name is changed, which means they are different beings. Right? And that happens with the covenant as we're changed because of the covenant and the power that comes upon us of the covenant, as we talked about last time. So the new name suggests a different person. All right? Probably happens with Isaac and Rebekah. We don't have that story. In any case, his name is changed there because of the power and the change that happens in him. The name, you can take this a couple of different ways, and President Nelson has talked about this. It comes from the word Sar, all right, which is it's Yitzra, so the S and R are in there, okay, and the Y is a prefix that has to do with verbs on there. It's a yod, so Sar, which means to persevere or contend or prevail, and El, which means God. All right, so literally this can mean he prevailed with God. That's a very reasonable way of translating this, but it can also mean God prevailed. All right, and my guess would be that it's just vague enough that both are intended. That it means that Jacob prevailed with God because he let God prevail in his life. And I would recommend you read the talk by President Nelson, Let God Prevail. So powerful, with so many incredible ideas in it. But I want you to think about this. This really is a profound thing. I think that it is saying that we prevail with God when we first let God prevail in our lives, prevail more than anything else in our lives, as President Nelson taught. That's a profound principle, all right? And then, as we said, Jacob asked the angel's name, and he says, I'm not going to tell you my name, but the very next thing is that Jacob says, I've seen God's face here, which makes you think that at some point he conversed with God there. Interestingly, in Genesis 48:16, he talks about the angel who redeemed him that he saw. And so I think we can piece together that Jacob has this literal wrestle with some kind of angelic being while he's having a spiritual wrestle with God, and then he's able to see God there and have the covenant renewed or furthered with him as he receives this blessing from God, and his nature is changed. And I think most likely sees the Lord face to face. It's an incredible story and an incredible event that happens because he's willing to go through the Abrahamic sacrifice. Because he will go through the Abrahamic sacrifice and has kept the Abrahamic covenant, he can receive these incredible blessings. That's a lesson for all of us. Now, we're going to end with this thought, but years later, he is told to take his family back to Bethel. He has to get them to get rid of their idols, right? So they are struggling. I think that it's likely that Rachel and Leah were struggling with idols. Rachel took some idols from her household. Remember, she's raised by an idolatrous family. And I think that they come to worship Jehovah and make covenants with Jehovah, but it's not instantaneous. I would suggest that there's a process. It takes some time to get the idolatry out of their lives. This is what they grew up with, and it takes some time. My guess is that they're worshiping both Jehovah and idols for a while. This is the trend that we'll see throughout the rest of the Old Testament, and it takes a while to get rid of them. And part of that process is happening here, whereas they're going to Bethel. God tells Jacob to bring his family to Bethel, and we know he at least renews the covenant with Jacob, and I will assume he does with his family. But as part of that process, Jacob says, bring me your idols. I've been tired. I'm putting words into his mouth, but it seems like he's saying, I've been tired of these idols. I've been trying to get rid of them. Bring me all your idols, and he buries them. He gets rid of the idols, right? It's part of the process of going to make that covenant with God, is they have to get rid of the world to bring more of God into their lives. Make more time for Christ, as President Nelson would say. And so they get rid of the idols, and he takes his family to Bethel, and as I said, I believe that the whole family enters into the covenant there, though they were born into it, that they individually enter into it there. We don't know that for sure, but that would seem to be the case. We also know that Rachel dies in giving birth to Benjamin, the last of the 12 sons of Israel, and that sets up the story that we'll cover next time, which is the story of Joseph and his brothers.